With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects, vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us.
I had fought the worst of all wars and witnessed the redemption of evil. I have seen balance restored to the Force. But order can turn to chaos, as it did when I was born. Now, with my loved ones and my loyal allies, I face a new challenge unlike any before. And I'm not sure at this time we can win.
Star Wars Vector Prime by R.A. Salvatore, the first novel of the new Jedi Order.
Hi, we're Radio Free Decipher, and we're talking now with R.A. Salvatore, Mr. Robert Salvatore.
Bob.
Bob Salvatore.
Just Bob.
Bob, sounds good. Author of Vector Prime and various other fantasy novels, including a lot of the Dungeons & Dragons,
Forgotten Realms
novels, and some other novels that we'll talk about here in a minute. But can you tell us a little bit about Vector Prime?
Yeah. Back in August of '98, I got a phone call from Del Rey.
Uh-huh.
And Shelley Shapiro, a friend of mine up there, one of the most respected editors in the field. I've been wanting to work with her for years. And she says, Bob, I need a favor. I need you to come on and do me a favor here, and it's going to be good for you too, I promise. And I need someone that can come in and do a job and do it right and do it fast. And I said, well, I'm very busy, but what do you need, Shelley? You know, I'm not going to say no to Shelley. She's a dear lady. She said, I want you to write the first book in the New Jedi Order. New Jedi Order, Star Wars, me, you know, and she says, yeah. And I love Star Wars, particularly the movies. I mean, I was an 18-year-old kid in that theater, just like anyone else, and watched that Star Destroyer come over my head.
Oh, man,
and it just blew me away. And so I wasn't going to do it initially because I was so busy. I'm doing a Dark Elf book every year, and I'm doing my favorite series, Demon War book, every year for Del Rey. But the next book I had due was the Demon War book. And she said, look, we can back that schedule to accommodate Star Wars. This is important. It didn't take much more persuading than that. And, you know, honestly, even when I was thinking, you know, do I really have the time to do this? Do I want 4 more months of hard work? It was always in the back of my mind, I'm going to get to write dialogue for Luke and Leia and Han.
That's got to be pretty special.
It was pretty special. So it was in August. They needed the book in November. So what they did is they gave me an overview of New Jedi Order, this new threat, the Vong, from another galaxy. Only they weren't even called the Vong then. They wanted me to name them. And I said no, because 21 books are going to follow. They should name them. It should be a committee decision.
So I believe there was another author originally assigned to start the New Jedi Order. I don't know too much about it. But what happened was Del Rey asked me, because they know I write books fast. If I can do that. I can produce a book, and I'm kind of crazy once I start writing. I can't stop. And they said, Bob, we want you to pause Demon Wars, and we really want you to come and do a Star Wars book. And I was like, a Star Wars book? I mean, I love the movies. But I wasn't up on the expanded universe because I was too busy trying to keep up with the Forgotten Realms for all those years. So they talked to me about it, and I said, sure, I'll do it, and absolutely, as long as you give me help, you give me resources so I know I'm not, like, contradicting everything. And they said, oh, yeah, we're going to make sure of that. So they told me about the New Jedi Order and what they wanted to do, and they gave me this kind of background on the Vong. And they said, we want you to go in this A to Z story, we want you to go from A to B, and we really want you to use all the characters from the novels and the movies, and they introduced me to a bunch of the characters from the novels. And we need you to just do a Pyrrhic victory, where they see the Vong, and we've kind of introduced them, and they think everything's okay, but it's not. So I said yes, I signed the contract, got the check, and put it in the bag, and wrote the outline. And I sent the outline in, and I was on a phone call with Del Rey and Lucasfilm, with I think it was Lucy Wilson. It might have been Sue Rostoni, but one of the Lucasfilm people, and Shelley Shapiro from Del Rey. And Lucasfilm was like, this is exactly what we want to start. This is perfect. This is just what we want. But didn't anyone tell you? I said, what? And they said, you have to kill Chewbacca. And I said, screw you. And they said, no, we're doing it for the right reasons. No, really, this comes from on high. This is right from the man. And I'm like, no. And who do I send the check to? And they were like, come on, Bob, come on, we need this, and we need this book done for Christmas. Come on. And they talked to Mike. He'll tell you why we're doing it. And I talked to Mike, and he explained to me the process that had led to this. And I said, all right, I'll do it, but you have to let me do it the way I want to. You have to let me write that scene. I don't want to be told how he has to go. And that was how it started for me. That's how I got into the Star Wars novels. What it was like writing it, though, man, you know, I picked up the job, if you will, to do the Star Wars book, and I thought, you know, this is going to be fun. It's going to be easy. And then I sat down to write, and you probably went through this too. And my hands were like shaking, and I'm like, I'm about to write dialogue for Princess Leia. Well, what the heck? How did this happen? It was bizarre.
Who was your favorite character then to do in Vector Prime?
Well, it's funny because when I was first asked to do Vector Prime, they pretty much told me who had to be in the book for protagonists. And, of course, the cast was like a cast of thousands. That's what it seemed like anyway. We had Luke and Han and Leia and Chewbacca and R2 and 3PO and Lando and Jason, Jaina and Anakin and Mara Jade. And I was very uncomfortable writing Mara Jade, putting her in the book, because for a couple of reasons. One, it was no character that I had seen on screen, and it's a character that had been very lovingly developed by other authors, and I really don't like doing that. And what I was going to do with Mara Jade was just have her kind of not be there, you know, like in Onslaught, I think Han pretty much did a cameo and took off, and you didn't really see him again. That kind of thing. And people say, no, you got to have Mara Jade, you got to have Mara Jade. And I came up with this idea, and of course, you know, your writing is a reflection of your real life, and during the time I was writing Vector Prime, this was probably the worst time of my life, these last couple of years. I was watching my best friend die of cancer, basically, my brother. And I said, you know, tell me about Mara Jade. And they started telling me about Mara Jade. And as they were telling me about this woman, she reminded me so much of my brother. And I said, well, how about if I give her a disease? How's that going to fly? So they had this big conversation about it. Now, of course, this is an entire plot thread that I've just added to NJO. Right. And they weren't unhappy about that because they've got to fill up 21 books.
Yeah. Right.
And so they came back and said, you going to give her a disease? I said, yeah, I'm going to give her a disease, and it's going to have come from Nom Manor, the agent. And they're like, very cool, go ahead. And I did. And oddly enough, this character I didn't even want to be in the book. And she didn't have many scenes in the book because it was such a huge group I had to deal with. I had to deal with 12 protagonists and the bad guys. Right. And I wanted to show a lot from their point of view, too. But the scenes when I was writing Mara Jade really hit home with me.
Yeah.
She was written excellently in Vector Prime. Really gained a lot of respect for her myself.
I can tell that Tim Zahn did something special in creating that character because, you know, I get probably, 10 emails a week about Vector Prime. And 4 of them, 2 of them will say nothing about it. 4 of them will say, you got her completely wrong, you're a jerk, we're going to kill you. And 4 will say, you did it perfectly. So I know that Tim did it really right with her because people have internalized that character like it's their own sister. So, you know, my hat's off to him for creating something like that.
Yeah, sure.
I love writing teenagers. I find teenagers incredibly interesting. When I was writing Vector Prime, writing Jason and Anakin and their little kind of philosophical battles was a blast.
Yeah,
it was,
definitely.
And
it was a blast to read.
Yeah. Enjoyed that.
Written the whole book just on a couple of characters, though, rather than writing it on 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of had the intro on that one, and that was really, I could see how that could be really tough, that you basically had to start this whole new series out with a whole new vein, with a whole new perspective, and
and the same characters.
A different perspective.
Yeah.
I get phone calls saying 3PO needs more lines, from Lucasfilm, and Chewie needs more lines, and I'm like, well, he doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
It was fun, though. I loved working with the Lucasfilm people. They were great to work with. I remember the only time they got mad at me, though, was when it was actually when I wrote Vector Prime, and I turned in the book. And in Vector Prime, I had put new cannons on the Millennium Falcon, new ion cannons on the Millennium Falcon. And the phone rings, and Sue Rostoni. And Sue is like the sweetest person in the world, just this wonderful book editor, and she's a wonderful editor. And, Sue's like a human bunny, okay? She's like the nicest, most easygoing person in the world. And I picked up the phone. Is Bob there? Yeah, who's this? It's Sue. Really? Don't touch the Falcon. What are you talking about? Don't touch the Falcon. I said, I just put new cannon. We don't touch the Falcon. I'm like, you just let me kill Chewie, and you don't want me to touch the Falcon? Don't touch the Falcon. They were very adamant about it. Do not touch the Falcon. At your peril. Mess with Luke, mess with the Falcon, and the black helicopters from Lucasfilm will show up and take you out.
One of the things I did in my book, in the rough draft of my book, is I put a new cannon on the Millennium Falcon.
Right.
I got screamed at, don't touch the Falcon. Don't touch the Falcon. So you're telling me that we could have offed any of the characters, but we can't touch the Falcon? Really?
Yeah, you have to understand. The characters we could have played with, but Hasbro was playing with the Falcon.
Oh, okay.
Put a cannon on the Falcon.
Yes.
Suddenly they got to redesign that. All those molds are different.
See how this works?
Yeah.
And actually, now for the last 10 years, 12 years, I've been working mostly for Hasbro, my Dark Elf books.
Well,
Now I understand.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Yeah. Hasbro makes all the difference right there.
Man.
Yeah. So
working for Hasbro and Lucasfilm. Wow, black helicopters must crash into each other over your roof.
Absolutely.
How did you feel about the Vong's progression throughout the story so far?
Well, it's one thing I think that everybody should keep in mind here, and this is the beauty of what's going on. I think a lot of people look at the Vong as this singular entity, and they're certainly not. There are a lot of clues dropped in Onslaught that Mike's Vong didn't much care for some of my Vong. And I'm sure that feeling was very reciprocal. I don't think that Nom Anor would care much for a lot of the Vong in Mike's. I found Mike's Vong more fanatic, more cruel, and more religiously driven, I think, than the ones in mine, kind of the advanced force. But that's the beauty of this enemy. This enemy is not one-dimensional. They're not a bunch of Imperial stormtroopers being guided by a singular force. You're going to see many different facets of this Vong culture and group over the course of the books.
I'm only 90 pages into it, and the very opening scene brings up that idea.
Yeah, definitely.
Not all the Vong get along or think the same way.
Oh, not at all, and that's the beauty of it.
It is.
They make a wonderful villain that way.
They will sustain through 21 books, or however many the end winds up being. I have no doubt about it. I hope that the people that are reading NJO keep in mind with every book they read that a lot of the things that might be questions to them now will be covered in a future book. The authors are very much hindered in what they can reveal and how much they can reveal, and it's all being done with a very, very big purpose in mind. Great care is being taken to kind of let this unfold to the readers in a way, the way it unfolds to the characters that are fighting against the Vong.
Right.
It's going to be a pretty amazing ride.
I had a quick question for you. On the cover of Vector Prime, the representation of the Vong, do you feel that's accurate?
I think Nom Anor could look a lot like that. Sure. I thought the cover was wonderful, by the way. And what they did with Chewie, with the Constellation Chewie, I thought was just brilliant. I love the cover of that book. I had no input into the cover.
Really? Wow.
Publishers don't talk to mere authors about covers. They just show us the final product and say, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, no, yeah.
In this case, I thought the cover for Vector Prime was perfect.
A lot of our fans are out there listening, would like to know is, can you tell us a little bit about the death of Chewie?
Yeah, the death of Chewie. I want to be known as the guy that did Dark Elf.
Right.
I want to be known even more than that as the guy that created Demon Wars, the whole Demon Wars saga.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be known as the guy that offed Chewie. Chewie! You know?
Right, everybody's favorite. So.
But we sat down and we talked about it. I spoke with Mike Stackpole about it. And my initial reaction was, if this is a marketing gimmick, I don't want anything to do with it. And once I learned the reasoning behind the whole decision, once I came to understand that the fear, more than the fear of losing characters had gone away from Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
The readers were no longer even the slightest bit anxious when somebody was in danger. And they needed to bring that back, plus the fact that they had changed the rules. This is New Jedi Order. This is a time when anytime you see one of your favorite characters in a dogfight or in a lightsaber fight, you should be very worried that they could go away, because they can go away.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you, I picked up the book like days after it came out, and I had heard nothing about it, and Chapter 17 hit, man, and
Chapter 17.
I was so involved in that book, I could not put it down. I was like, my Lord, what is going to happen next? And that's exactly the feel that I think you guys were looking for.
There have been so many books. There have been so many, that everybody knew nobody could die. And, yeah, I understood that was, I don't want to say cheapening, it was more like weakening. The suspense of the books was what he convinced me of. I didn't want it to be Chewie, though. But I didn't know it could be someone else. I would have argued, Lando, you're gone. Or something like that.
That's low-hanging fruit.
Because I'm a low-hanging coward, okay? And when it came to the scene, it was like, this was before cell phones? No. Lucy, are you sure? Can't I have them, hit him with a tether and pull them off behind him? Okay. But the one stipulation I made was that, okay, I'll do it, but I'm doing it the way I want to do it. And I thought about Chewie a lot, and the way I would want to do it. You remember that old poster called The Last Great Act of Defiance?
Yes.
Where it's got this mouse standing there, and he's giving a finger to this gigantic eagle that's about to take him out. That was kind of my inspiration. I wanted Chewie standing there shaking that Wookiee fist at the moon. And I figured if you're going to take out a Wookiee, it's got to be a moon. I thought it would be epic. That picture, right? That last act of defiance. Saves Anakin and they can't save him. And Han's watching the whole thing and not believing it. My favorite scene in Vector Prime was at the end when Han realized that the bubble of invincibility was gone.
There you go.
And Han was he thought it could never happen. It hurt like hell. It hurt like hell. Of course it did. How could it not? I grew up with Star Wars too.
My favorite chapter in the book is actually the last chapter in the book when Han's talking about it, and talk a little more about that in a minute if you want. But there was something weird was happening in my life at the time that actually I can tell you now. My cat had been hit by a car. We lost a cat, and it was brutal. And for the first time in my life, in the loss situation, I had to be the adult. Up until that point when I had lost pets, I always had my mom and dad telling me. Now I had to tell my kids about it and explain it all to them. And that was a very trying time. And it was even more trying because at the time my mother-in-law was ill with terminal cancer. My brother, who passed away right after Vector Prime came out, was ill with terminal cancer. And now it was almost like a warm-up to tell the family about the cat. And I don't want to trivialize Chewie's death by talking about my cat, because anyone's had a pet and lost it knows. I mean, we had this cat for 9 years. It was like the coolest animal living. And I remember one day soon after I buried the cat, and I walked out of my garage, and I have this little convertible out there, and it was winter, so the top was up. And I looked on the bonnet. The cat, this was the only cat we had that would go outside. And when the cat wouldn't come in at night, we'd put the garage door up about 4 or 5 inches so the cat could get in the garage at least. And the cat would come in and sleep on the bonnet of the convertible. And when I went down to the car, there on the bonnet was all the hair.
Oh, man.
And that's where I got that whole thing about the hat. And it hurt. It hurt to do it. But all bets are off. I mean, on New Jedi Order, you should be afraid.
Yeah.
I think it makes it more fun.
Yeah, I've been reading all the sequels to it that Michael Stackpole's been writing, and it's some phenomenal writing, and the stories just absolutely hooked me. So.
And you never know.
Yeah.
Every time they're in trouble,
time I read it, I'm
just
like,
don't
man,
know.
are they going to kill somebody off?
And I'll tell you now originally they had told me they had planned Chewie's death to be this. They hadn't planned it out. But they were really looking for was like this one-on-one fight where Chewie just takes the bullet for Han, so to speak. With Han cradling his head as he's dying, and I didn't want to do that for a couple of reasons. And I said, I'll do this, but you got to let me do it my way. So I've said before, and I'll say again, I won't take responsibility for the decision, but I will take responsibility for how it was done.
Okay.
Because that was all my idea. That was the way I wanted to do it. And the reason was I really wanted to do something that would... Remember, I'm writing a book that's got to fuel 20 novels after it with different writers. I wanted to not give Han a focus for his anger. I know that, if he had seen a particular Vong, if Nama Nor had killed Chewie, then Han would be on this life quest to kill Nama Nor.
Yeah.
But now... he's even more lost.
He's milling around the apartment.
He doesn't know what to think.
Right.
He didn't even know it was the Vong at the time. I'm sure he's figuring that out now, but his focus is less direct, and that makes it all the more painful for him. And I hear Jim Lucino did some really good stuff with that in the next 2 books coming. I can't wait to read them.
It's always hard to see a loved character go, or a character that you feel a connection to.
Oh, it's hard to write.
Yeah, I bet.
Hard to write, but if you don't do it, once in a while at least, you get into this, I like to call it the EverQuest and Ultima syndrome, Ultima Online syndrome. I'm not putting them down, I love those games. But, where if you die, you spawn somewhere else, you loot your body, and you go on with it.
Right.
Fantasy books can't be like that. There seems to be this understanding now that fantasy books, it's almost like more of a comic mentality, where, you have a running series, and the hero will survive or will come back if they die, and fantasy was never supposed to be that. Fantasy is an alternate reality. It's escapism, but it's not escapism from the truths of the world. It's not escapism from the fact that heroes die and people die. And, that ultimate sacrifice is a necessary ingredient in fantasy. Fantasy is an escapism from a world where the individual doesn't count into a world where the hero, that single hero, can really make a difference. It's very hard to make a real difference on a big scale in our world. You can't. The political system, you got to be rich and that whole thing, you can make a personal difference on a small level. You can go work for Habitat for Humanity. You can just help out someone on the street. But in fantasy, you can be the hero that saves the world.
Absolutely.
You may die doing it, but that's okay. Especially if I'm writing it.
Well, to change up a little bit, you are also going to be doing, that was your first Star Wars novel, and you're going to be doing some other Star Wars, at least a novel.
I'm going to be, about 2 months ago, I got a call from Del Rey, and Shelley Shapiro said, George wants you. A few months before that, when, like I said, my brother had died, Vector Prime came out, I was in a really bad place, got some very angry reaction. I knew I was going to. We didn't know the depth of it. And I kind of just told them, I'm done with Star Wars. That's it. Have your galaxy far, far away and leave me to my own worlds.
Okay.
But then they called and asked if I would be willing to be put on the list to do the novelization for Ep 2. Because the way it works is Del Rey presents a list of authors they want to work with. That list goes to Lucas Books and Lucas Licensing, and they all go over it, and they narrow it down, and they present the final list to George Lucas, who makes the decision. And so I said, sure, put me on the list. I didn't think anything would come of it. Some pretty tough competition on that list. But then, I got the call, and George Lucas said me. And so I'm doing the novelization for Ep 2, which is really kind of cool. I can't wait.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
When I was given Vector Prime, I was given some very specific instructions. And they liked the way it came off. Del Rey was very pleased with the book, especially since I came in kind of at the last minute. And Lucasfilm, I loved working with them. They loved working with me. I find them to be a very professional group. More so than they're giving credit by people who like to be cynical about things. But they're a very incredible group of people out there who care so deeply. And I think Del Rey had asked me, will you do more NJO? And I wasn't sure I really wanted to. It was a tough time for me in a lot of ways, and I'm very busy anyway. But then we talked about Ep 2 a little bit, and I said, well, it'd be hard to say no to something like that. and I got put on a list, and then I just found out a couple of weeks ago, they called me up and said, hey, George said yes. Oh, really? Make room in my schedule. You know, when I was writing Vector Prime, they called me up and said, all right, you got to sign this non-disclosure agreement. We're going to send you the novelization for TPM. We're going to send you some of the cuts, you know, some of the outtakes, trailers, whatever. We're going to send you, I don't know, maybe even the script, you know, but all of that was offered to me when I was writing Vector Prime. And I said, no. I want to go into that theater without having seen a single trailer. And I think I enjoyed the movie a lot more because I didn't kind of beat it up on preconceptions before I went in there.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it. What I like to do, like maybe the last book in NJO, kind of do the bookends. And I'm certainly going to keep up with the series. I'm going to read every book that comes out intently. I enjoy it a lot.
Yeah. No, this is...
Well, it's gotten off to one heck of a good start.
Yeah. I mean, even just to start, the last 3 novels out in the Star Wars universe, which is Onslaught and Ruin and Vector Prime, have been hands down. It's like 1, 2, 3. There's my favorites.
Yeah.
You know, I got to tell you, I talked to Shelley Shapiro, and I said, you know, what book are you working on now? And she was working on Balance Point. I said, well, how'd it go? And she says, fantastic. Which didn't surprise me. I said, well, what about Lucino's novels? And she just had one word for me. Wow. So, you know, here's the point I want to make about this, too, and this is some of the criticisms I've seen of NJO that you know, I sit there and I laugh when they talk about sloppy editing or the people don't care or they're just trying to get your money. And I sit there and go, oh, my God, how much can you miss a point by? The care I've seen concerning this series and picking the right authors for the right books. You know, I get shivers thinking about it. I know most of the people working in NJO, and they're incredible. And when I've talked to Shelley Shapiro, and she's told me what books they're doing and the general storyline between what they're going to accomplish in their books, they are handpicking these authors carefully to fit in with the books that will best serve the particular author.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. And, you know, it's like, I can't wait to see what Matt Stover does with the Vong. I don't know if you've read Matt Stover before. If you haven't, go read Heroes Die. And this guy's got dark down in a completely different way. It's amazing what he can do on the dark side. Well, you know, the book I'm probably most looking forward to read is Greg Keyes. Because Greg Keyes, if you've ever read The Waterborne, does cultures in a way that you've never seen done before.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
I'm just telling you, the lineup they have is amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I know the books these people are writing. You know, Elaine Cunningham does a book, and I believe she might be doing something about Jaina. I hope she is. She's perfect for that book. Well, the other thing too that's going to be, and this is not a criticism of Bantam Doubleday Dell books, but this series is so much more controlled from beginning to end.
Yeah.
That you're not going to see inconsistencies that aren't there for a reason if they do it right, and I expect they will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty amazing thing. When, you know, Jim Lucino he can't write his book without knowing everything that came before, and Kathy Tyers can't write her book without knowing everything that came before.
Right.
That's true.
Everything will build. And I think the readers are going to be the readers that hang with NJO are in for the ride of their lives, I think. That's why I'm going to be one of the readers. I can't wait.
Yeah, no, I can't wait on that either.
You know, I mean, I remember the attention that garnered. All of a sudden, mainstream press was talking about Star Wars books, you know, and so I think it definitely rejuvenated the novels, which you know, after the first set of books, you were starting to get how many super weapons can you do, and our heroes were just getting through every single situation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because you kill off Chewbacca in the first book of a very long series. You have that thought in the back of your head, oh my God, if Chewbacca the Wookiee doesn't survive anyone.
No one is safe.
Yeah, right.
I know, because, I mean, you don't want it to be predictable. You know, there's got to be some sort of, and there has to be some sort of real peril for your characters.
And you mentioned how it did get a lot of mainstream coverage when that happened. I know exactly what you're saying. I'll never forget the day I opened up Entertainment Weekly, and there was the spoiler. It was like the week the book was released, and they printed the death of Chewbacca in their like, it was they did like a top 10 this week or something. I haven't looked at Entertainment Weekly in a while, but they used to have this list, and it said the death of Chewbacca, and it caught my attention right away.
I did it. I killed Chewie. And the death threats started almost immediately. It was an incredible time. I didn't have to go into hiding, but we did actually alter a couple of stops on the book tour because we thought there were people out there in those particular locations who were going to start trouble if I showed up. It was interesting.
I'm starting to get this bloodthirsty reputation, you know? You squish one Wookiee, and they never forgive you. Did you know that October 5th was Remember Chewie Day on Facebook? All right, tell the world it wasn't my idea. Okay? They figured somebody had to get hit, so they hired an Italian to do it. I had one woman writing to me, and every day I would get another email from her. I can't believe you killed Chewbacca. How dare you kill Chewbacca? And with each one was getting a little more desperate and a little more angry, day after day after day. I don't know how you get tear stains on emails. Finally, we got to the end, and I got this letter, and she must have been dictating or something, because you could hear the confusion in her words. She was saying, and I was going to read these books to my kids, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. How am I going to read these books to my kids? What am I going to tell my children? And I had enough. I wasn't in a good mood. I shouldn't have done it, but I did anyway. I wrote back to her, and I said, tell your kids he's playing with Old Yeller. I should have done that. But I didn't get any more emails.
And what amazed me about that, though, is that after the book came out, in addition to the death threats, I got emails from people going, aha, they never found the body. I'm like, it's a moon, dude. They ripped the atmosphere off the planet. Anything and everything on that planet is dead. Period. Nope, they never found the body. I refuse to believe it. Well, I remember soon after the book came out, a 40-year-old guy came up to me. So he was younger than I was. And he started crying. And he told me about how when he was a kid, he was younger than me. That's right. When he was a kid, he was sleeping with his Chewie doll. And what did you do to me? And I don't have an answer for that. This is the other thing about the book, is that was probably the worst year of my life. Personal level, I was basically, my brother was dying of cancer, and he was my best friend. And that's also the year I wrote Mortalis, which is my favorite book because it was my catharsis. In fact, I had to cancel the tour for Vector Prime because I was supposed to start at the World Trade Center, at the borders at the World Trade Center. They were still up then. This was before 2001. It was 1999, actually. In fact, yeah, it was 1999. I had to cancel my tour because that was the day of my brother's last MRI. So it became a double whammy for me, honestly, because at the same time, my brother died 10 days later or 8 days later or something. At the same time I was dealing with that, I was getting letters from people who were like really mad at me about the death of Chewbacca. And it was kind of this weird juxtaposition where I was dealing with the loss of my brother, of my older brother, my hero. And I was having to answer to people who were mad at me for killing a movie character on a level that I did not even understand was possible. So it was a very, very weird time for me. That was the dark year. Yeah. Y'all feel bad now, don't you?
I'm a professional writer, okay? My job is to do what I'm paid to do it the best I can, and to make all of you react. So if they had decided that Luke had to die, Luke would have died as heroically as Chewie did, all right? And the grief would have been palpable. If Leia had to die, or Han had to die, or any of those characters had to die, you would have still hated whoever wrote that book, okay? Because you would have been bawling your eyes out. All right? But that's what I'm paid to do. You know, in some ways, you know, it's like being a villain in a movie. You know, that's what you're paid to do. And if you hate the character on the screen, do you then suddenly hate the actor? No.
Yes.
Well,
wait, no.
No, the answer is no. Yeah.
No.
I am one of the people that signed off on Chewie's death. I was one of the guys that said, yep, he's the one that's got to go. And I take full responsibility for that. And, you know, everybody who gave death threats to Bob Salvatore should be utterly ashamed of yourself. But, you know, Chewie was the one who had to die. And we all understood that, and that was the choice that we made.
One thing I do definitely in Jedi Talk, and it seems like all our fans want to do this as well, is we really want to apologize for the fellow fans out there that went way off the deep end with Vector Prime.
Well, you know, Vector Prime's an easy book to hate if you're a Star Wars fan.
Well, I don't think so. I think that, and I think that most of the people that I've talked to anyway will agree, and I hope that you haven't gotten a tainted view of Vector Prime because of it. But this book was needed. It was definitely, it was great. It was a great read, but on top of that, it was great for the universe. Because all of a sudden, by doing a couple things in Vector Prime, we have opened up, or what's opened up for the Star Wars fans is a whole new universe of possibilities again, which is something we haven't had since, for a while. It started to get kind of stagnant, and this is, it really opened that up for us.
Del Rey knew that.
Yeah.
Lucasfilm knew that.
Yeah.
Mike Stackpole knows that. And Jim Lucino knows that. And Kathy Tyers knows that. And everybody else, Troy Denning and Matt Stover and Greg Keyes and Elaine Cunningham and all the rest of them that are coming after understand that we have a ton of possibilities now. But when I say it's an easy book for a Star Wars fan to hate, look at all the things that happened. I mean, Chewie.
Yeah.
Still hurt thinking about that.
Yeah,
I mean, Mara Jade's sick, and it doesn't look good. Honestly, I can't tell you whether she's going to make it or not because I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, here's a book that's it's like a new beginning, but for a lot of people who love the Bantam Doubleday Dell series, that's kind of a turnoff. A lot of people wanted that series to continue.
Yeah.
It's a different tone for Star Wars. It's a little bit darker.
Yeah,
so, you know, I understand the frustrations that a lot of people are feeling.
Yeah. It really did bring a lot more life back into the novels, though.
And excitement.
Absolutely.
I'm riveted to reading them. I go out to the stores when they're released. I use every Jedi Talk power that I have to try to get an early copy. By the way, that doesn't work. I was just
feel bad. They haven't even sent me a ruin yet.
Well, apparently it doesn't work on either side. But did you know that people would have such a strong response to Vector Prime?
Oh, none of us did. When Mike Stackpole read Vector Prime long before it came out. He called me up and he says, "You got it. Be prepared, though. There's going to be some people very upset with you about Chewie and Mara." And but even Mike has called me and we just shook our heads. And you know, Lucasfilm called me up soon after. And of course, you got to understand again the timing of it all. Vector Prime came out on October 5th. On October 5th, I was scheduled to be at a major book signing in downtown Manhattan at a big Borders to kind of launch the book and the tour. October 5th was also the day my brother had the CAT scan that basically said it was all over. Mm-hmm. So here I am, you know, and then of course when I canceled the tour, everybody had to know why, and when they found out why, I mean, 2 days before my brother died, I'm apologizing to him about the Washington Post saying that I had to cancel my tour to take care of my brother who was dying of pancreatic cancer. So it was a very weird and very stressful time. I can be very honest about that. And Lucasfilm would call me up and say, "How you holding up? Are you okay?" You know, and I'm, "Yeah, I can handle it. I can handle it." I was itching for a fight, and it's a good thing I wasn't on the road.
Yeah. Like I say, I think it's unexcusable what some of the fans did out there, and once again, we really apologize for that.
No, that's part of the business. That's why they pay me. Well, that's part of the business. But I will tell you, my only problem with the criticism that's continuing of Vector Prime, my only problem with it, these people, I got really shook by a lot of it because there was so much of it. I mean, my email cache was filling up daily. And I went back and I read the book with a pad and paper on one side of me and the criticisms on the other, just very recently. And man, the things that people are saying that aren't in there, and the things that people are accusing of being in there that aren't in there. You know, it's an amazing thing. But my only problem with it is that I think some people have actually posted more anti-Vector Prime stuff out there, more words against Vector Prime than I wrote in writing the book. And it's kind of scary to me. But my only problem with that is I'm afraid that people coming in reading the book are coming in reading the book with a sneer. You know what I mean? Instead of just reading it to enjoy it.
Yeah. I certainly hope that. Yeah, it's a great book, and I hope that Star Wars fans do. If you haven't read it yet, it's one of the best out there.
Now they wanted me to stir things up, but I guess I did, huh?
And it's not only, because of people reacting to Chewie. You have to remember that was also the time when Phantom Menace had come out. And for the first time, that bubble of invincibility about Star Wars evaporated. All the critics who had never been able to say anything bad about the original 3 films, because they were so popular and they knew they would get lynched, had a field day. You guys may not remember this. They had a field day.
They remember.
Yeah. But, they were going nuts with Phantom Menace. And the criticism of the books was just a follow-on. Everybody realized they could get a piece out of Lucasfilm, and unfortunately, Bob was the first guy up and got tagged with that. And it actually was almost me. Because I almost...
So why didn't you do it and give me book 2?
Well, that's because I was supposed to do 2, 3, and 4.
Uh-huh.
And so they decided if they gave me 1, they'd have to take those 3 away, and replacing me at that point would have been too difficult.
There you go.
But I asked if I could have it.
Okay.
And that was the decision.
Okay.
So you almost didn't have that. When you look at it also, Han Solo is probably the strongest character out of the main characters.
Not probably.
Without a doubt. He was the strongest character there. Chewie's death was going to be devastating for him. And plus, quite frankly, there basically was no runner-up. Chewie was the obvious one. Look, there was no way to get inside of his head to tell that story.
So the dog couldn't talk, so you clubbed the dog.
Pretty much. That was pretty much it. And
I'm just putting it in English.
But technically, you clubbed the dog.
No.
With a big rock.
Thanks,
it was
Mike.
an awful damn big rock.
Thanks, Mike. It's true. I hit the dog. I love dogs. I tell you, in the span of about 3 months after that book got out, I got more 1-star reviews on Amazon from my other books. There were people chasing me around the internet. It was unbelievable.
I remember.
Life of a Writer. I remember seeing one long post on 4star.net where it was like, who is this punk to come into this galaxy and just decide to kill Chewbacca? What? And I'm sitting there thinking, do you really think an author can walk in and do something like that? It just amazed me that there were people who thought that I just said, oh yeah, I'm going to write a Star Wars book and I think I'll kill Chewbacca.
Yeah,
and it was like, you don't get it, man. You don't get it.
Well, I remember Bob called me one time to discuss some of this stuff, and on forums, again, they were just creaming him.
Yeah.
And I went out and checked some of this stuff out, and one of the guys, I saw the guys who were criticizing him. I went and checked the X-Wing forums, and some of the guys who were criticizing him the most loudly were the ones who loved the X-Wing books. And one of them specifically said, in criticism of Bob's book, they said, well, I'm not really worried about this in the Yuuzhan Vong because Stackpole's up next and he will fix this. and my response to him was, 2 assumptions here are incorrect. One, you think I think he was doing anything wrong. I don't. And
Who was the first person who read Vector Prime?
So there we go. But the second thing I said to this guy is that, and if you don't like his Yuuzhan Vong, you're going to hate mine. His were the brown shirts. Mine are the Waffen SS. This is not going to be pretty. And so that guy, I think, had a few sleepless nights, which was good. You want to contribute to insomnia in those cases.
So I'd like to ask, did killing Chewie in Vector Prime accomplish the goal you wanted it to as the New Jedi Order played out, in your opinions?
I think it did, because it made the characters vulnerable. It made people actually worry when it looked like someone was going to die. And it also, quite frankly, it opened Lucasfilm up to be able to okay the killing of a few other characters. One of the Jedi that I created in Onslaught, Ganner, was somebody I would have loved to have written more stories about, but he got smoked later on, which is quite right in that sort of a battle. Ganner. Those are the things that are going to happen.
I mean, I put Peter Mayhew out of work, and I love Chewie. So, I mean, I'm not going to say I regret it, but I think this is the only thing I've ever done as a writer that I have to honestly say I regret. I think a lot of people got hurt, and it bothered me. I don't like to hurt people. That's not who I am. But I understand why they did it. I got to tell you, over the years, for as many people who have been upset with me, there have been people who thank me. It's been even more than 50-50, I would say, in favor of thank you. I was getting bored. I didn't think anyone was going to die, and he died. And maybe they just felt bad for me because they heard what happened. I don't know.
Look, part of our job is to present you another reality and to layer it with emotion. All right? You are letting us do that by reading our words and taking them into your brain. But that's a heck of a lot of trust. Not every writer can layer those emotions in. And this is why Bob, me, a lot of other good writers, when we do that, we're crying. Yeah. We're feeling we're feeling the emotions that you're going to feel. When we've worked with a character for 3 years, because we've worked on a series, and we've had them in a set of books, and we decide that they have to die, I mean, not only is it like hearing that, somebody was in a car accident, but you designated their death. So not only do you feel that lack and that pain and that grief, you also are guilty as hell. Yep. And that's, I was raised Catholic, so guilt is just, you're just steeped in it, so yeah.
It's pretty obvious if you look at Celebration. You watch the 501st in action, right? It's pretty obvious that the people that watch these movies found friends. And, they've carried them with them their whole lives. And, that's real. That kind of stuff is real. And we're at a Comic-Con, so you guys know better than anyone. When you find a friend in a book, that friend is real to you. And Chewie was just, he was the one, he was the solid, even in the original movies, he was like the center that everyone else revolved around, right? I mean, Chewie he's let the Wookiee win, man. My favorite scene in the movie is when they were warned that, if you win, he's going to rip your arms off, right? I mean, how can you not love Chewie? So, I don't know. And my favorite scene to write in the book was Han and Chewie trying to run the asteroid belt and just kind of one pulling one way, the other pulling up the other way. Nothing happens, but that was the right move. Just that whole crazy, even though he didn't speak in the movies, his relationship with Han was pretty clear, right? So, he was a friend. He was a friend to anyone who loves Star Wars.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, a common trait of characters that we all love is that they're incredibly loyal. Yeah. And you can always count on them. And I think the other thing with Star Wars especially is that all those shots of the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon,
which you can't touch.
I know. Yeah. Well, who wants to have a cannon? I mean, rockets, man. It's all in rockets.
It was a rocket cannon.
Well, that would have been okay.
No.
But in all of those shots, you've got Han and you've got Chewie, and then you've got a spare spot, and it's really easy for us to project ourselves into being on an adventure with them. You could be the third musketeer.
Sure.
And I think it was a safe place. It would have been a fun, adventurous place. We all know that. And so that is something where I think we all ended up projecting ourselves, whether we knew it or not. And as a result, to lose one of the musketeers, that's That is very, very painful. And I do have to say, I mean, you know, Bob did the job really, really well because it did have the emotional impact. And I know that there were tons of people who hated that. And there were people who would go, and because of that, he's a bad writer. And you know, my response to that always was, no, he's a great writer because he made you cry. You know, he got in there and expressed that emotion.
For about 3 years after that book came out, every time one of those fluorescent lights flickered, I thought it was a kid with a lightsaber coming to find me.
You know, it could be worse, though, James. I bet every day you wake up and thank your lucky stars you're not R.A. Salvatore.
Oh, poor, yeah. I mean, he really heard from the worst segment of fandom out there. I mean, they just wouldn't let the guy alone. And Bob is a very, you know, he's a big guy, but he's a sensitive guy, and he really took it to heart. And it really had an effect on him for a number of months. I mean, he was really brought low by that.
The irony is probably it wasn't even his original decision to do it. It was probably just part of the overall outline.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't his decision. That was already a plot point that was in there that he had to write. And I commiserated with him a lot by just telling him about what Brian and I went through with Britai. There were other writers. There were 2 other writers assigned to do that book. Bob came into that late because the original writers didn't work out.
You know, there were certain books rejected over the course of the series because they didn't hew to the master plan. Even the very beginning, you know, Salvatore came in and replaced 2 other writers. So there was another version, you know, of the beginning of the series that was nixed, you know, and that happened a couple of times through the series where books just felt wrong. They felt wrong. They weren't hewing closely enough to what we were trying to do.
I started reading the Star Wars books when I was about 14, Heir to the Empire and all that stuff. And they were great. They were wonderful. And then I read, you know, The Truce at Bakura and on and on and on and on. And one of the things that I kept noticing is that Han, Luke, and Leia and Chewie were always getting in trouble. Han, Luke, and Leia were always getting in trouble. Lando was there. Everybody's getting in trouble. Everybody was almost dying, almost dying, almost dying, almost dying. Nobody died. It got old. And I read them. I forced myself to read some of these books.
I stopped reading.
He stopped reading. I guess the point I'm trying to make is the Star Wars books lost a lot for me, and I know for a lot of fans, because nothing was happening. And then Chewie died. And there you go.
Yeah.
And that was, and unfortunately, that's the rejuvenation in my eyes that it needed. Other than these great offshoot series that are focusing on some of the lesser known characters.
Right. The thing is, if you're writing fiction in which people are endangered, you're going to write fiction in which people die. At that point, you have only one choice: to choose between killing the characters who are not important to anybody and killing those who are. If you kill only characters who are not important to anybody, then where's the emotional engagement?
They're the red-shirted ensign from Star Trek who,
people,
you know they're going to die.
People will instinctively know that this war only kills people who don't matter. And that's not what we need to be saying about war. So if you're going to suggest that war is not the best way to accomplish something, you don't want to just then knock off the people that don't matter. They have to be important to the readers for them to feel something, to arrive at the realization that this conflict is not a good thing.
Even if you've got your main characters sacrosanct,
yeah,
you can still create some of this tension by bringing in alternative extras and connecting those with the reader. Now, you've done that. I mean, you weren't going to be allowed to kill off Luke or Wedge.
Right.
But you got other characters there, and there's no guarantees on
And
that.
even with the established characters, if you set up initially, they have a specific goal that is tremendously important to them, and you endanger that goal, then, you know, the possibility for your favorite character suffering mightily in the short term, perhaps medium or long term, it exists, and you care about that. He was somebody that was close to the heart. He obviously affected Han, affected main characters.
But in the overall, at that point in time, he was a non-essential character. He was an overglorified babysitter, unfortunately. Because, everybody else was off on adventures, he'd be stuck with the twins.
Yeah.
And, of course, Anakin.
Well, in my defense, I put him doing that because I had no spot in the Hand of Thrawn duology for Chewie.
Well, but that's just
that's why he never showed up. Yes.
No, it wasn't you, though. It was everybody else did the same thing. So it was almost like that's just that was the role he ended up fitting. Whether it was your decision or anybody's decision, it's just the role he just fell into. And so with the one final act of heroism, it brought him back to everybody's to the forefront, and then it was so much more powerful.
Chewbacca desperately needed his own series away from Han. We needed to have a Paw of Chewbacca series where he would have his own goals, his own adventures.
Are you listening, Mr. Lucas?
And had that happened, had he had his own life, perhaps he would have survived the start of the Jedi Order, and somebody else would have died. But that never happened. He was extraneous. Sad to say, he was well beloved, and I'm not saying he shouldn't have been, but he was extraneous.
The world's biggest stuffed animal.
Basically.
I have with me now Steve Saffel of Del Rey Books. Now, there's been a lot of interesting things that you've been publishing recently on the Star Wars universe. You've had the New Jedi Order series, been taking the characters in some very unusual new directions. How are you feeling about that series?
I think it's going really well. I love Vector Prime. I thought that Bob Salvatore did so many wonderful things with that novel, and he had such a tall order. It was so hard to be the person to launch the New Jedi Order. I can't even imagine how he did it so well. And I think that the fans are reacting, saying that they think this is a really great new direction.
Yeah, I imagine you've had a lot of reactions. I mean, starting off the series, of course, with Vector Prime, in which we see Chewbacca killed off. What's been the reaction of that type of material?
Well, of course, it's always going to be a mixed reaction, and everybody has their own personal feelings about it. But I got to say that one of the things it's done is it's tossed back in the drama.
Yes.
Because really, for there to be drama in the Star Wars universe, there has to be a sense of sort of the humanity of it, and there have to be ramifications.
Right.
If things that go on in the Star Wars universe have no ramifications, they go nowhere, then there is no human drama. And this is what makes the Star Wars universe dramatic. People are now wondering, because it's no longer given that somebody is going to be around, that somebody is going to stay the same. The sense of change, the sense of excitement is really coursing through the Star Wars universe, through the novels.
My understanding is that Del Rey had gone to LFL and said, well, we want to have a major character death to kick off the NJO, just to make people understand how severe the stakes are this time.
Yeah.
And I'm fairly sure that they basically told Bob Salvatore, it's Chewie. And, there was a massive shitstorm about that in fandom.
Oh, yeah.
People were very upset with him. I thought it was kind of cool. I mean, if you're going to take out one of the iconic characters, that is a pretty awesome way to go.
Drop a moon on him.
But not only dropped a moon on him, but had him, if I recall correctly, standing up and howling defiance.
Right, like he was going to stop it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, if you talk about an epic send-off.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the way I want to go. Drop a moon on me.
Well, they actually pulled that in Infinity War.
But which would they?
Didn't they drop a moon on Iron Man in Infinity War?
I honestly, I've not.
Or an asteroid or something.
Yeah, right.
I'm not saying that that's where they got the idea.
Right.
I'm just saying that a cool thing to do is a cool thing to do. I mean, I the first time I came across that was in that sort of trope was in the Lensman books, Doc Smith, pulp stuff from the 30s through the 50s. A lot of the books revolved around this sort of escalating arms race between the good guys and the bad guys. And one of the things that the good guys did is smashed the home planet of the bad guys between two other planets.
Yeah, that's something that I love about science fiction and fantasy is just how epic you can go.
Yep.
When we put an end to something, we're going all in, right?
Well, yeah. And the amazing thing about Star Wars was it was kind of the first time where somebody put on screen like starship battles that you could buy into, that you could believe in and care about what happens.
Yeah.
Going back to 1977, I'm going to ask you, how did you get the role of Chewbacca in the first place?
I was in the right place at the right time. I'd done a previous movie. Two makeup guys were talking. They were looking for an actor or someone to play a big hairy creature at the time. My name was suggested. I went up and saw George, saw the drawings on his wall, and within 20 minutes of being introduced to him, the deal was done and Chewie was mine. So it worked out very, very nicely. And, people say, has playing Chewie affected your life? Of course it has.
Yes.
I wouldn't have been able to, if I hadn't have played Chewie, I wouldn't have been able to meet and done half the things that I have done in the past. So it's a wonderful feeling, and it's something that has gone down in the annals of sci-fi forever.
Do you actually read some Star Wars novels?
No, I don't.
Or comics?
Some of the comics I will look through, but my good lady reads everything Star Wars that you can imagine.
Really?
From not the comics, but the hardback books.
Oh, that's cool.
So I get told what's going on, even though it's not relevant to the movies.
Yes.
She reads everything, and she'll talk to me. Oh, this is happening in this book, and this book, and this book is relevant to this.
Did you enjoy the Chewbacca comic?
Yes, it was. I thought it was a good comic, and it was nice that I got to do the narration in the front of it in the composite stories, and it was nice. It was an interesting comic.
Okay. Of course, latest series, New Jedi Order, just finished last week.
Yep.
We're already halfway through the reading of our book. And how did you react when your lady came to you and she said, "You're dead"?
Actually, she was as surprised as I was, because we just come home from Germany, and I was living in England. We'd gone over there to sort my house out before I moved to the States, and I got a phone call from one of her family asking whether I was all right, because the reports, some DJ on a radio station he'd heard that the book had come out, and he'd read the headlines, Peter Mayhew is dead.
Oops.
Instead of Chewie.
Yes.
So that was flashed across the radio waves. And, are you all right? Yeah, sure. Why? Oh, people have heard on the radio that Peter Mayhew was dead. No. But
rumor of your death has been greatly exaggerated.
Yeah, I got a phone call from Steve Sansweet about a week, 10 days before.
Okay.
Saying that this book was coming out and Chewie dies of it.
Oh.
So, but he said one thing about it. When Darth Vader died, on a comparison note, when Darth Vader died, he became more popular, and Chewie hopefully will do the same thing, and it's working out that way. So,
how did you thought, like, in order to kill the Super Chewie, you have to actually crash a moon on his head? How was your reaction to the scene of the death?
Until I read, that was one of the books that I actually read. When you hear that, they've crashed the moon on him, blah blah, I think, well, he's tough. He's been through hell and high water, and therefore it's got to be something like that, pretty big to kill someone. And when you work it out, there was, out of the main group that remains, Chewie is the only one logically that you can kill off.
Yes.
Because you've got to have a hero, which is Luke. You've got to have the romance, which is Leia and Han. 3PO and R2 go right the way through, so Chewie's the obvious choice. Unfortunately, but we were told that it didn't affect any of the current movies, because the book is set 25 years after Jedi. So, okay, fine. We went to Celebration last year, and the author was there.
Yes.
He called me over and he said, I want to make amends for this. Went over to his booth and he handed me a personalised copy of his book, and all it's got in the front of it is "Sorry, mate." So, and signed. So, things are getting better. Now we're the best of friends, so
great.
It's nice that we can do things like this.
Yeah.
And the fans love it. The fans love it, and so it's great.
Well, not all the fans love the death of Chewbacca, but now they're getting around with it.
Now they're getting around to it. They know that they'll see him one last time in Episode 3, so that will make a lot of fans very, very happy.
A surreal moment in my life. I was at Star Wars Celebration 2 in Indianapolis, signing Vector Prime, and it's swarms of people in this convention hall, right?
Right.
And I was like right in the middle of the hall. I wasn't in one of the side rooms. So there's like thousands of people all around, walking around in the outfits. The 501st was there with their stormtroopers and everything. And all of a sudden I hear this noise, and I look up, and the crowd is parting, and there's this 7'6" giant walking toward me.
Oh no.
It was Peter Mayhew.
Yeah.
And he came around the table and he dropped his hands on my shoulder, and I had a picture on my Facebook page. I look like I'm about 8 years old next to him. His hands are like this big, right? And he's kind of choking me, and he goes, "We got to talk." And then later we talked. He wanted me to sign one of the books for his kid, He's just, I miss him. I only saw him at conventions, and I feel like I lost one of my best friends when he passed, because he's one of the most gracious human beings I've ever met in my life. We'd be walking through, and he'd see me and Diane. He'd be like, "Hey, Diane, get him, get over here." He's got this long line. He's interrupting it so we can go over and say hi to Peter. Just a wonderful man.
We're joined right about now with Michael A. Stackpole, a very cool guy. Let me introduce him for you. He's the award-winning New York Times best-selling game designer, sci-fi and Star Wars author, best known to us Star Wars fan for his many novels in the X-Wing series and the NGO Dark Tide duology, as well as, of course, iJedi. Well, Star Wars on Direct welcomes Michael A. Stackpole. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Glad to be here.
So, the first question I have to ask you, what was your first Star Wars experience? How do you remember it?
Literally the Christmas before it was released. On Christmas Eve, my brother and a friend of ours and I had done our Christmas shopping, and so to kill time, we went out to see a movie, and it was Clint Eastwood's movie, The Gauntlet, a very forgettable movie, except that it was shot in Phoenix, which is where I happen to be right now. And they had a trailer for Star Wars, and it totally blew me away. And the next day at Christmas, I got a gift certificate to a bookstore, and I went down and bought the novelization of Star Wars, and I thought that was very cool. And then when the movie was coming out, I was working for my father at the time, so I took the day off. The first showing in Burlington, Vermont was 11 o'clock in the morning. There were 17 of us in the theater, and we were absolutely blown away. That changed filmmaking forever. And what was very funny was that 2 nights later, we were back, and the theater was packed. Absolutely packed. So, you could see right from there. I mean, it was just off on a rocket, as it were.
like you, I was 7 when I saw Star Wars in the theaters for the first time. Did you have visions of being an author or something? Were you a science fiction fan or military novel type fan beforehand, or
the idea of being a writer was always there. When I was in first grade, I wrote a poem that my mother thought was great, and she sent it off to a magazine. So the first piece of mail I ever got addressed to me that was not a Christmas card or birthday card from a relative was a rejection slip. And so at age of 6, I swore eternal vengeance on publishing, and have been fighting that way ever since.
You know, most kids, they would have given up at that point, but not Michael Stackpole.
No. How dare you think I'm not good enough? You know.
I'm fortunate that I get to talk to a lot of people who have had their different starts with Star Wars, and so then they went on and you started. What were some of your earlier forays into novels?
Bantam, of course, at the time had the Star Wars license. Bantam was using Star Wars as a way to promote their authors, and so I was really lucky that they decided to take out a license tied to the X-Wing computer game.
Mm-hmm.
When they sort of ticked off all the boxes, I was the only guy in their stable that could hit all of those things. And lo and behold, you know, I remember my agent called, because I live in Arizona, so it was 6 a.m. When she called, and it was Bantam just offered you 4 Star Wars novels. I said yes. I mean, that was, you know, so I really, there was no deliberation on my part, you know, it was all locked and loaded at that point. But,
That's pretty funny. So she made this, by the way, you're doing this, right?
Well, we talked to her about the possibility of doing Star Wars stuff, but you know, that's every freelance writer. Tell your agent, by the way, you know, if Bantam's ever looking,
right?
And then lo and behold, so.
Wow. And I mean, those 4 books came out like within, was it 18 months or so of each other? 2 years?
It was they came out one every 4 months.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. They just banged right out.
When I was putting together the characters for Rogue Squadron, I knew that I would need a mix of individuals who would work well together but be clearly delineated. Mm-hmm. And in building that, I had to start with Wedge. And Wedge was an interesting character because he was a feared warrior, really, really good, a great leader, and yet he was Luke's best friend.
Right.
And so you really can't imagine him being one of these hard-charging jerks. So that sort of set him up. And then I had Tycho, who was extremely competent warrior, was under a lot of pressure, you know, had some adverse things going on, had some things he didn't know about, and so he became one kind of character. And I decided one of the other things that I wanted to do in the squadron was have people from different worlds, have different species together. And every Corellian in the saga up to that point was a smuggler or a thief, or had done time as a smuggler or a thief.
Right.
And so it was like, well, geez, Corellia cannot just be run by smugglers and thieves. There's got to be somebody who's the equivalent of the Coast Guard.
True.
So I said, and that's who my guy will be. You know, he is a Corellian cop.
Corran Horn is different from your stereotypical Jedi character. Tell us a little bit about him and how you came up with his concept.
The idea about having him coming in from a Jedi tradition and slowly learning that he was a Jedi was built really out of 2 things. One, there is no way that you can have Star Wars without a Jedi somewhere.
Right.
I mean, you just have to. And I knew I wasn't going to have Luke, so I needed someone else. What's kind of curious about it is that I knew for the first 4 X-Wing novels that Corran would have to be a key character because you can't really have Star Wars without the Jedi somewhere. But I really wanted to downplay it and just slowly bring that aspect of Corran in. Corran became a lot more popular than I ever expected he would. Same thing with Tycho. The 2 of them suddenly started developing adherence that I had never expected. And so all of a sudden, you know, we started gearing things toward what people seem to be areas of interest that people seem to have. Now, Jedi was a story that obviously is focused on Corran, but it was a story I thought needed to be told no matter who the Jedi was. I thought we needed in the canon a first Luke had already gone through his, wrestling with the dark side period. So it was kind of a wide open story, but I'd mentioned it to my editor, and he said, yeah, let's do it. And Corran was just a natural guy to drop in there. In the New Jedi Order books that I had, I wanted to use Corran, and originally I was told, no, don't use him, totally de-emphasize Corran. And yet, when the second round of negotiations about the books came around, all of a sudden Lucasfilm, for some reason, had turned around 180 degrees and said, oh yeah, use Corran, focus on Corran.
The New Jedi Order books were part of a very massive storyline. How did you prepare to write your 2 books in that series? Was there like a writer's room situation?
When the license went over to Del Rey had a summit meeting at Skywalker Ranch. I was invited to it, as were the guys from Dark Horse, and then the Lucasfilm people were there. And it had just worked out that I was the only person in the room who had read Tim Zahn's last novel.
Oh, wow.
So because we were going to be taking off from where that ended, a lot of questions got deferred to me of, can we do this or can't we? Basically, I was there while the stuff was being done. I was there as things were being designed and developed and set up. So there really wasn't any research that I had to do per se, because we were starting right at the beginning. We also knew at the time that the first book, which was Bob Salvatore's book, that book was coming out in hardback. Mm-hmm. And we knew from book sales at the time that there would be a bunch of readers who read that, and there would be a bunch of readers who wouldn't read that. So Bob's was book 1, and then my book Onslaught was also going to be book 1 of the series. Because I had to reintroduce the Vong just in case people had not actually read Vector Prime.
Right.
So the story was divided up and things were put together. And, I knew what was going to come after my stuff. I knew what I had to set up. And I did all of those things. It was a very ambitious project.
I read Vector Prime, I think, in the second or third draft. And I know Bob Salvatore. I like Bob Salvatore a lot. And I thought he did a really good job with what he was given to work with. He really was tasked with some very difficult stuff to do. I thought he handled it very, very well. And I do have to say this. I mean, poor Bob has gotten death threats. And I just feel kind of mortified by that because, I'm one of the guys who talked him into coming in and playing. And I remember one of the first conversations we had, I said, look, Bob, you know the TSR fans, you know the Dungeons & Dragons fans. Trust me, the Star Wars fans are great. I mean, everybody's been so nice to me. And then for people to get so angry with Bob, it's like, guys, don't you understand? We do what we are asked to do. And we do it as best we can. But there is nothing that gets done in these books that is not approved at Lucasfilm.
Definitely. That wasn't Bob's choice. That was more Lucasfilm's choice. Apparently yours.
Well, there was someone on the list and someone checked that one off, so.
Well, did you just put all those names in a hat and pull one out?
No. Actually, I mean, it was a lot more deliberate than that. What ended up happening, and this was why Chewie got tapped to die first. We looked at all of the main characters as potential characters to be killed off in that first book. And we agreed that the impact of the death of any of those characters would be huge. So then what we looked at and explored was how would we tell the story of the impact of this character's death. And when you look at the character who died, and you look at how central and foundational a role he had for so many of those characters who now have that support withdrawn. From a novelist point of view, this is dynamite stuff. Everyone's going to be affected. You have all the youngsters who have had this person around forever, and now they've had this loss. And you've got other characters who have been, supported by this individual forever and ever, and now they're without that support. So as far as drama goes, that was probably the key character that we could have pulled. And so that was really why that character got tapped. One of the coolest things I think with the new Jedi Order is that everybody knows that not everybody's going to make it out alive. And I think that adds a lot of attention that we really haven't had before. And it's funny because it's something that we were able to get into the X-Wing books, both mine and Aaron's,
because we knew that there were, here were these characters that you've never heard of in later books, so maybe they aren't going to survive. And so there were a lot of people sort of wondering what was going to go on.
I like playing with readers' expectations. If writers give readers the stories that readers expect, the readers don't need the writers anymore.
Right.
So, when we can throw them the curveball, and when they can go back and they can say, oh yeah, I can see how we got here, I just didn't see it coming. I wasn't able to keep my eye on the ball enough, but it makes sense. You have them forever as a reader.
Everything with Rogue Squadron, as you said, you could really see it building up, except you couldn't really see it as you were first reading it. Yeah, a lot of stuff that happened in that series really threw readers for a loop. Everything that happened with Tycho, the apparent death of Corran, Corran turning down the acceptance into the Jedi Academy, all kinds of stuff like that. It was, and not knowing what was going to happen with the characters as far as who was going to live and who was going to die. And really, after the series started going, because there were no major characters in the story, I mean, really, Wedge was the only major character, and he didn't really have a big part in the films, it really kept the readers on their toes.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was in play.
Exactly.
Part of the job being a writer is to give your readers this emotional roller coaster, to make them feel things.
Right.
To get them more involved than just a television show is going to, or just staring at pictures is going to do.
If you do a really good job characterizing characters, and to me the mark of doing a really good job in that is this: if a reader reading about those characters starts projecting in their own mind what's going to happen to the character tomorrow, or what's going to happen to the character 2 or 3 years down the line, you've absolutely got that reader. And when you end up killing that character, the reaction that it provokes is a really strong one. And one of the things that's really important is that if you don't kill some characters, then your threats are never real. And the second thing, and this is a real subtle one, is that there is a danger in writing fiction, especially about wars and battles, where no character that the reader identifies with dies, which ends up making the readers think, hey, this war thing is really not so bad.
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah.
When you have that impact, when you kill somebody that they like, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a minute. I guess war is not so cool after all. And that's, and one of the things, it's really funny with the X-Wing books especially, the vast majority of mail I get is from 6th graders. And if 6th grade boys have to be reading these books and figuring out war is not a good idea, gosh, that's just breaking my heart.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I mean, that's really showing responsibility in the way you're writing these things. Oh, I think so.
In Dark Tide Onslaught, which was my follow-up, the first scene where you see Han, he is devastated. And when I sent the first draft of that in, the editor said, you have to dial this back, because later on in the series, when we kill other people, no one else will be able to write a grief scene with Han Solo that will be this impactful. And my response to that editorial note was, hire better writers. I'm not writing with training wheels just because you've got, you don't think the other guys can stack up. I mean, this is, if you're going to write an honest book, you've got to show Han Solo in the absolute depths of depression. And so that's why that chapter was, what that chapter was.
Which is your favorite Star Wars movie and why?
I'm still going to say Empire Strikes Back. And it may be, I guess I would like to flatter myself and say that, Onslaught and Ruin have got a lot of that same feeling of menace.
Yeah.
It was really, when you think about it, Empire Strikes Back is really the film that proves our heroes are heroes. Because they keep going even after they lose. Even in the last moments of that film, it's like, look, we'll split up, we'll meet here, we're going to get Han back, we're going to finish this job. And that to me is the essence of being a hero. It's all great and wonderful to do things when, the Empire is not working too well, or they don't think the Death Star can be blown up. It's another thing entirely to get past being kicked around. And so that's what I like, and hopefully, like I say, that's sort of the feel that we were searching for Onslaught and Ruin, and with any luck, I'll get within hailing distance of it.
I did feel it in Onslaught that Anakin in the end kind of came around to a whole new attitude. So
Anakin was a lot of fun to play with in that book. I mean, I enjoyed writing him a lot more than I ever expected I would.
One of the things that was decided above my pay grade and that I never liked was him dying. I personally thought that was a waste of a character. And this is part of the reason why I characterized him as much and did as much with him as I did in the 2 books I did in NJO, because I was hoping that maybe somebody would decide that he'd get a reprieve.
Really? Yeah, he's so powerful. I always, in the Corellian trilogy especially shows how powerful he is in the Force, and then it was just amazing to see how the authors have kind of, in a sense, curbed him, just given him more insight into himself. It's almost as if he holds himself back a little bit.
Yeah, and I think because he is a thoughtful character, because he's got to worry about the other Anakin. That's got to be sort of dancing in the back of his mind somewhere. That it makes him interesting. How much will he hold himself back? Will he ever let himself go? What happens when he does?
Yeah. In fact, in Onslaught, that was one of my favorite parts of the book, was the encounter and the discussion between Mara and Anakin with regard to how he used the Force. Love that.
He was a lot of fun to write. I got to write Mara on a couple of different occasions, and she is the one who's had the training. She is more knowledgeable, but from a side that is not the side that Luke would come from. So, this is someone who is kind of his antithesis. Street smart, understands a lot of what's going on and everything like that. Again, Nine Jedi, there's the scene where she saves Corran's life, and that was a lot of fun to do.
Now, I noticed in the New Jedi Order, you really build up Mara to be an incredibly strong character. I also noticed that Leia and Jaina are now doing some really serious work. And with the addition of Dani to the storyline, in my opinion, it really made the female cast very strong. Is this something you plan to do? I mean, to continue the strong woman theme of Star Wars? Or did it just work out that way?
Oh, definitely. When we were planning, we sat down and we looked at the mix of characters that were going to come into the story. We looked at their individual story arcs, how we wanted to see them develop, and how we wanted to position them so that readers coming from different backgrounds would be able to sort of, latch onto characters and say, okay, this is the person I want to identify with, this is the person I want to identify with. You will see as the books go along, as is obvious from Onslaught and, be continued in Ruin, Han Solo plays a very small part in what I'm doing. And this is because the books that come after mine by Jim Lucino, the Agents of Chaos books, deal very heavily with Han. Consequently, there are going to be other characters who are minimized in those books. Because we did this long saga, we're going to be able to focus on characters. So sometimes you're going to, I won't say lose track of, but you're not going to see as much of a favorite character as you might have wanted to. But yeah, strong female characters, strong characters in general, and story arcs for these characters actually develop and something happens as opposed to just episodic fiction. Where, everybody's the same at the end of the book as they were at the beginning of the book and just went through a roller coaster ride. This is really what we're searching for here.
Now, in Onslaught, you made Jaina a member of the Rogue Squadron. Was this your idea, or was it Lucasfilm?
I would love to claim that it was mine. I can't honestly remember. I know it was discussed in the meetings, and I could have possibly brought it up, and probably very likely did bring it up as almost a wise guy remark, and then someone said, oh, that'd be a good idea. In which case I said, well, obviously I'm brilliant, and yes, we'll do that.
So are you then.
You said Star Wars kind of needs that Jedi, that Force-sensitive character in there, and certainly within the X-Wing series, there's very limited places where you could put those. It's almost a natural that it has to be someone within the squadron itself. And now we get toward the new Jedi Order stuff. We've got Kip Duron leading his own squadron out there, though not Rogue Squadron. We get Jaina as being part of Rogue Squadron itself. There have been people who have made the comment that Rogue Squadron in part kind of gets taken further away from its roots and further away from this idea of it being hotshot pilots when you start adding the Force into it in greater numbers. I'm curious what your response would be to that.
I can certainly see that point, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. I think the important thing with Corran is that once he began to develop his Jedi powers, once he moved over to becoming a Jedi, this was the point where he really bounced out of the squadron. And while he was still a pilot, and while he might still go on missions, he had really sort of transcended the squadron at that point. So I agree. I think the squadron is a place where you ought to have normal characters. I think the reason that Jaina gets tossed into Rogue Squadron is because we were attempting to show just how desperate the situation was, that you needed people filling in roles wherever they could, and here you were willing to take a young kid, a very valuable character within the universe, and put them in a dangerous position, because this is exactly how desperate things were.
My favorite characters are the pilots. Specifically, my favorite character is Biggs Darklighter. So, as a huge fan, I was wondering what made you choose Gavin Darklighter and carrying on the Darklighter legacy.
A chunk of that was based on the research that I had done about fighter pilots and all those things. You know, when you look at World War I and especially World War II, you had a lot of people who were underage volunteering for military service because they felt it was their duty. And I thought that it would be kind of cool to bring a Darklighter back in and to have Gavin be that kid and kind of be the one that everybody in the squadron would try and look out for, but have him be very competent and carrying on that tradition. So it just felt right to me to be able to go ahead and do that because it fit with the whole paradigm, and it provided a connection into the past, and yet a character that we knew everybody was going to be pulling for.
I'm curious, if the more pilots that have a sensitivity, or the more you try to make sure that you keep a Force-sensitive pilot in there, be it Corran or Jaina or whomever, that it sort of takes away from the bravery and the sacrifice of the other characters.
What you have to see is that Rogue Squadron and the stories that are being told about Rogue Squadron or any of the squadrons are pilot stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has to be the emphasis. They're not Jedi stories who are also pilots. These are pilots. If they have Jedi powers, and this is another thing which I think unfortunately writers forget, and I think fans forget sometimes, being a Jedi is not this great overpowering thing. Some people have got they've got really strong powers. Some people don't have particularly strong powers. Luke gets shot up. His snowspeeder goes down on Hoth. We have bunches of different things can happen. With Jedi characters, obviously, as we saw in the third movie, are not impervious to getting shot. So, if you're going to be writing that sort of stuff, don't let the Jedi-ness overpower it. One of the things which I greatly enjoyed dealing with Corran, and this was a conscious decision that I had to make, Kevin J. Anderson, when he created Kip Duron, made somebody who was tougher than Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Was able to stand up to Luke toe-to-toe. And I think that was a bad choice. And this is part of the reason why Corran does not have the same powers that Luke does. And so he has to learn how to use the Force differently. And I really like that diversity in equipping your Jedi with different of the Force powers to come up with someone who handles situations entirely differently. Corran can't do things with blunt Force trauma in mind. He's got to be a little bit more clever because he just doesn't have the heavy-hitting stuff.
Right. I've heard him described as sort of the MacGyver Jedi. He's the one who tries to find some alternate solution before having to usually resort to using the Jedi training because he spent so much of his life not having to use it or not having access to it.
Exactly.
We knew that Spectre, iJedi, and Vision were kind of an ersatz trilogy that encapsulated, Luke's soul-searching period.
Mm-hmm.
And iJedi, Corran Horn basically tells Luke Skywalker off in the middle of that book. And Vision came out, and Mara basically says to Luke, Corran was right.
Mm-hmm.
And really kind of helped tie up the Luke Skywalker saga, at least as it went through the Bantam books.
In I, Jedi, there's a few sayings or proverbs that really stick out, including if you cannot recognize the man in the mirror, it's time to step back and see when you stop being yourself. Was this one or any of the others based on advice you've been given or give yourself, or just completely out the ether?
Well, they weren't completely out of the ether. A chunk of research for that book was, reading a certain amount of Zen Buddhist material and, those sorts of things. But I've always liked reading aphorisms and little sayings like that. The quintessential one of know yourself. I mean, really, that's just kind of a variation off of that.
In your Angel books, Luke is kind of like a one-man army. Like, the first thing he does in Onslaught is beating up a couple of Yuuzhan Vong without killing them and then moving a black hole. That was intentional or not?
Definitely intentional. I mean, look, you got to figure that with Vision of the Future and Luke getting back together, that's going to make him a lot tougher. I mean, I think mentally, I sort of figured that once we got through Vision, Luke, while he'd been being called a Jedi Master, finally he got there. Okay, and I certainly wanted to show him in that capacity of, look, this is what a fully empowered Jedi is going to look like, and so it's sort of like, here he is, the guy from Jabba's palace on steroids. Okay, and so I very much wanted to do that.
A lot of us had a rather sinking feeling about the standing of the Jedi reading Onslaught. Can you express why? Because none of us seem to be, at least on the show, be able to put our finger on it.
Why you had a sinking feeling about what's going on with the Jedi?
Yeah.
Well, I think, you have a basic situation where you've got roughly 100 Jedi. You've got a fairly serious split in terms of attitude between them. And you're really not getting any support out of the New Republic for them. So yeah, things do not look good for our team in that particular situation. One of the cool things about the new Jedi Order, and I think one of the things that everybody ought to bear in mind, is that it's a fairly ambitious project. I mean, we're looking at a sweep of 20, 25 novels encompassing this whole saga. And you have to remember that it's going to unfold in that sense, and it's going to take a while. I mean, it's kind of frustrating for me as a writer to be putting characters into a position to be asking a lot of questions, knowing someone else is going to provide some of those answers somewhere down the line. But by the same token, it is going to be unbelievably cool. Just the stuff that I know is coming up, and just the stuff in Onslaught, and the things that I'm doing in Ruin. I think everybody's going to be I think they'll be real happy. I think they'll be real shocked, and that's kind of cool.
Anything you want to mention, Mike, to the fans out there right now?
I look at the response to Onslaught was just stunning, and I'm real happy that they were happy with the book, and hopefully they'll like Ruin. And
you didn't kill anybody, Michael.
Oh, come on, I dented a Nagri.
That's true. That is true.
Going into Ruin, so
Yeah.
Lots of things die in Ruin.
There goes my sleep for the month.
I think what you're going to end up seeing is, again, an escalation of stuff that you've seen in Vector Prime and Onslaught. You're going to see these heroes really pushed beyond the level that you've seen them before, and when you get that much pressure going on, some people break, some people excel. I think it's just going to be really exciting. I mean, again, I'm really looking forward to reading the books, and the talent that they've got lined up to work on it, I think it's just going to be able to turn out Star Wars books that of a type that you've not seen before. But they're just going to be able to expand that envelope, and I'm just thinking that's going to be great.
Why was Dark Tide bumped down from 3 books to 2 books?
Yeah, there are a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that as the new Jedi Order was being slotted into the production schedule, as they were looking for what they wanted to do with books and titles and stuff like that, originally where they thought they were going to have space for, say, 5 titles in between hardbacks, It looks like the production schedule is going to work better with 4. And at that point in time, Onslaught had just been finished. We were looking at what was going to be going on in the other 2 books. There was this crunch. It basically came down to an agreement between Del Rey and I that we could probably take the Kojin events out of both books, jam them together. There'll be some things that are lost, and I'm kind of sorry about that. But this is the way things go. So it's as they say, those who love law and sausages should see neither being made, and that probably goes on for long series of media-related fiction.
Darktide was supposed to be a trilogy with Onslaught, Siege, and Ruin. What happened with Siege?
What happened with Siege was this: is that the editor and I had some creative differences, and we both basically decided that we would probably kill each other if we ended up working on a trilogy with each other. So we just changed the contract to a 2-book deal, and that was okay because that ended up giving a book to someone else who wanted one. So that worked out as far as I was concerned. The stuff that would have been in Siege, you really didn't lose anything. You lost maybe a couple of elements of some subplots, but there really wasn't anything. It all kind of got rolled into Ruin. So there was, there's. I know some people have wondered, if I've got the manuscript of Siege sitting around here somewhere, and no, that was, we had an outline, and the really important elements of that outline got rolled into Ruin. So.
And there I was thinking that we might see something pop on eBay.
Yeah, well, there's the word to any collectors out there. If you see a manuscript copy of Siege turn up on eBay, don't buy it.
This next question is about the story of Darktide Siege. Do you have any idea of why it was canceled? Like, are you allowed to talk about it? What was going to happen in it? And, did the content of it make it to other novels, either written by you or by other authors?
Yeah, originally I had a 3-book deal. And remember, this was at the time when the books shifted from Bantam to Del Rey. And also when The Phantom Menace had come out. Mm-hmm. And when The Phantom Menace came out, there seemed in the whole approval process to be an extra layer of input that we had never had before. And as a result, with Onslaught, I got a 16-page revision memo. And I just don't get 16-page revision memos. And so I knew that if I made the changes that were requested in that memo, that the book would be horrible. And I wasn't going to have a book be horrible in the Star Wars universe and go out over my name. I wrote them a 17-page note explaining why these things in the revision memo, the ones that were really, really bad, explaining why they were really, really bad. And I said, I'm not going to make these changes. To whom do I send the check for my advance? You can have it back. As we negotiated out what was going to go on, I basically said, look, I'm not putting up with this for 2 more novels. So we agreed to just do Onslaught and Ruin. And the events that were going to be in Siege, the ones that needed to be included, that were points that had to be hit, showed up in Ruin. Siege was not going to be your typical second book in a trilogy, which is just sort of marking time until we get to the 3rd book. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of stuff there that wasn't vital. So we basically freed up a book in the contract for them to give it to someone else to do some other stuff. And so that's what happened there. So I did Onslaught, I did Ruin. They both hit the New York Times bestseller list. Ruin hit the highest that any of my books had done. So that was successful, but that was that.
I believe it's Darktide Siege, the one that was canceled and kind of split up into your books, and then Luceno had more time to do his. Was that kind of like more the team thing, or was it just really didn't fit into what you guys were trying to do?
That was actually a disagreement. You have to remember that the Yuuzhan Vong books, the New Jedi Order books, were the first books that Del Rey had done. And Del Rey's procedure was different than Bantam's had been. And I had a disagreement with the editor over the editing of Onslaught. And we mutually agreed that the 3-book contract would become a 2-book contract. I'm sure I no more wanted how they were editing it than they wanted to have to edit me. So we had a little bit of creative difference, but I'm still very proud of those 2 books, and that was a mutually agreed upon decision.
And in fact, I think Mike's 3rd book, he was originally going to do 3 books, and the Yuuzhan Vong were a little too barbaric in his 3rd book. And I think that was the problem. That's why eventually it was taken out. We got together and said, listen, if we go in this direction, they're really just there's going to be no way for them to be interesting. They're just going to be barbarian the whole way. And so, yeah, we had to constantly be trimming back on things like that. I was sad to see Mike's book go, but again, that was one of those committee decisions in the end.
Yeah. Were you always slated to do 2 for Agents of Chaos, or did that expand your thing to 2?
Yeah, that's what happened. It was expanded. I thought I was 1 and out.
What do you do to prepare to write a Star Wars novel, or any novel for that matter?
Well, pretty much any novel, when you're setting up to do it, you have a couple of things that you have to do. One, you have to do a lot of research. In doing the research for a Star Wars novel, that means reading a lot of the other books, is looking over the source material, because there is just so much stuff that you'll find very, very useful, and that you can draw on. Second thing that you have to do, and this is really critical, I think, for doing a really good novel set in someone else's universe, is you have to look at what the story is that you're telling and make sure that it fits within the universe, and that the characters that you're telling the story about, that you make sure that the changes they're going to go through fit in the universe. And that's real tough. That has to be a judgment call. For me with Corran, the initial arc, because I was only visualizing it through the 4 X-Wing books, was his growth as a human being, his discovering that he's got this Jedi heritage, which would open all sorts of possibilities for him. And then through I, Jedi and the 2 Dark Tide books, I was able to realize some more of that, for which I am very, very grateful. And so that was a lot of fun. But like I say, making sure the characters fit in the universe, I think, is absolutely critical. And then you just have to keep up on it. And perhaps third, if there are other authors who are working in the universe and you're lucky enough to know them or to get to know them, and you can pass things back and forth, boy, that makes it a lot of fun. When another author can call you up and say, hey, look, here's something I want to do. Do you have a place that you can plant a seed? And if you can, that's really, it works out really, really well for you. It makes their books better. It really ties the whole line together.
I'm proud of all the work that I did in the Star Wars universe. I remember very distinctly, and this is funny because I've seen, obviously, Revenge of the Sith several times now. But I remember I was in the process of writing Onslaught and I got to go to a press screening for Phantom Menace.
Okay.
And the lightsaber duel in the back of that movie blew me away. And I suddenly realized, now the expectations for a lightsaber duel are so much higher than they were before.
Yeah.
And so I really had to push myself to try and get the lightsaber duels that I was writing into those 2 books to be visual and to have that fluid motion. And again, I had to work really hard, and I learned a lot doing that. And that's actually influenced how I've done action scenes in a number of other books.
Yeah, that's the really cool thing. I mean, the guys at the Wizards of the Coast had made the comment, Lisa Stevens and Phil Slavicek had made the comment that Star Wars has swoosh. Star Wars has that screaming sound of X-Wings moving through and that sort of, it's hard to quantify, but you know when it's not there.
Yeah.
And if it's not there, it doesn't feel like Star Wars. And if it is there, boy, it doesn't matter if it's characters you've never heard about before, or if it's, a new threat or anything, you just know it's Star Wars. And I think that's, it's part pace, it's part humor, it's part, part wise guy humor, and romance and everything. I mean, that's perhaps the coolest thing about those films is that they have all of those elements, and they've got them in this wonderful little mix that keeps you off balance and keeps you interested, and that's why I think they're really just so magical.
Yeah, I think that's one thing is that the Vong makes such an interesting villain is to our perception, yes, they're evil, and the things they've done, but to their perception, they're doing what's right.
Oh yeah,
and it makes a wonderful villain. I mean, they're really just great. Yeah, so love them.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, especially for me. The second book, Ruin. It was a lot of fun being able to characterize Shadao Shai. I mean, really just taking him from the epilogue in the first book and then carrying him on through, and his discussions with Elagos. Those were some of the most fun parts of writing that book, just because you're seeing him, not seeing himself as evil, but seeing himself as being absolutely right, and compared to these other people who, they can sort with machines, and they're, it's just hideous. So that was a lot of fun to write.
What's the Vong? What is the proper pronunciation?
I've always called him Yuzon Vong.
Yuzon. Okay.
Okay. All right.
That works for me too. Yeah.
But I suppose it's the Cantonese Mandarin split. It's just how you pronounce it.
The one that I got to do a lot with and really enjoyed was Elagos. And I mean, Elagos went through a fairly short arc, with me, and which does not end as hopefully as we might want.
No, it does not.
But it also was, one of those growth arcs and a very heroic arc, and so he was a lot of fun to write.
You did some pretty ugly, nasty things to Ithor in Ruin. Was it you that got to choose that planet as the victim of the Yuuzhan Vong in that novel, or was that sort of a directive from just the overall project, not necessarily an individual choice, maybe to show, I don't know, the Vong destroying something that is very nature-oriented to play into their characters somehow?
To be very honest, I do not. It was the death of Ithor was something that came up in the very first round of meetings, and originally was going to be the capper to the very first novel. And I cannot remember who tapped that world per se. I suspect it was either me or Sue Rustoni of Lucasfilm, just because Sue was a continuity person, and I was deep enough into the continuity at that point that I knew that Ithor, just a totally peaceful planet, it would be, if it's destroyed, that's almost as bad. The idea of turning it into this burning cinder was as much of a desecration as blowing up Alderaan. So, as a symbol, we knew that would probably be the world to go. Like I say, I can't remember who named it or whatever, but I was really kind of happy when the first novel in the series got revamped, such that the destruction of Ithor fell to me. I had great fun doing that.
If you look at, from Rogue Squadron through Ruin, if you look at that as an 8-book Corran Horn character cycle, okay, who he was, in the first line in Rogue Squadron, and who he is at the end of Ruin, he has really matured incredibly. And especially, in Rogue Squadron, he's looking for that role model. He's looking for someone to be his moral compass. And by the end of it, he's assumed enough responsibility and gotten to the point where he knows. He doesn't need an outside moral compass anymore. He knows what's going on. Right. And knows that he's got a better handle on what's going on, within his life than he ever did before.
There were a number of readers whose first exposure to Corran Horn was reading I, Jedi. They had not read the X-Wing books.
Right.
And because I, Jedi was told first person, they assumed that I, Jedi was just my personal fantasy and me putting myself in as the character of Corran Horn. Now,
Corin and I are nothing alike. I don't think I'd even like Corin if he was, in the room. What is funny is that Corin and I do share hair color and we do share eye color.
Okay.
But the reason for that is this. When I was doing the research into fighter pilots, aces tend to be relatively small, tend to have light eyes.
Interesting.
And so it just works out. And I've got green eyes. So green eyes are not exotic to me because I see them every morning.
Right.
But they're fairly exotic to other people. So to me, I had denied that Corin and I were the same person because we're not.
You mentioned talking about pilots. Did you have to do a lot of research on military customs or procedures to write about the fighter pilots effectively, or did it just come naturally, or did you just use kind of general information that you had?
No, I did a lot of research. I was fairly lucky in that the time when I was doing the research was right around the 50th anniversary of D-Day.
Oh, okay.
So there were a lot of TV specials and an inordinate number about fighter squadrons. And so I would listen to the veterans talk about how things went. I would read pilot biographies. I would talk to pilots. I would watch specials and read books specifically about piloting and tactics. And I logged an ungodly number of hours on the X-Wing game.
I remember that game.
Oh yeah, I think I went through 3 joysticks.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, an inordinate number of hours on that stupid game.
Oh, that was a good game back then.
Oh, it was a really
like
good game.
The premier flight simulator back then.
Oh yeah, no, it was a great flight simulator, and I mean, I loved it. I think that in terms of game design, I think TIE Fighter was better.
Absolutely, and actually, a lot of fans say that. A lot of people quote TIE Fighter as being the better game. But
yeah, and that's why in Ice Lord's Revenge, I put some of those advanced TIE Fighters in there and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I had enjoyed, and it gave me an excuse for firing the machine up and practicing so I could describe things right. Of course, it was all research.
There you go. Yeah, work-related research, of course.
Yep.
There's this theme of like newfound family where someone could have a family that is beyond their own like bloodline, that it could be made of like friends. And I noticed this theme strongly in the X-Wing books. Was this like an intention of yours to do this? Like, was the squadron meant to be a new family for Corran Horn since he had lost his father to Bossk?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, again, when I was doing the research, and in doing research, I read a lot of, I talked to pilots. I also read a lot of pilot biographies. One of the things that you find is that the squadron or any military unit does become a family. One of the weird things when I was researching was that when you were a member of a squadron in combat and new replacement people came in, very often the older members of the unit would not want to get to know them because they had already lost a lot of friends and they didn't want to lose any more friends. And if you read through Rogue Squadron, Wedge never addresses any of the new pilots that he's dealing with on a first name basis as friends until they've survived 5 missions. Because one of the other things that I found in doing the research is that if you are a fighter pilot, chances are you will die before you've completed your 5th mission or after your 15th mission. That it takes you that long to get used to it, to understand what's going on. And so Wedge was, deliberately holding himself apart. But once that reticence breaks down, once you realize these people are going to be around and they're going to be there for you, and I think that that's a pretty good definition of family in the way you're talking about, then you form a very strong connection. And so that's really very much what I was going for there. And I think we see it even today when you have people, reunions of military units. My brother went to West Point, and his cadet company still gets together for reunions, even though it's about 40 years now since he got out of West Point, because there's something about that bonding that does make them very much of a family.
One of the things that I find
citations and reading biographies and reading about these people, it is amazing what it takes to be a hero, how selfless they are. And as near as I can tell in reading these citations, some guy and his buddies are in a vicious situation, and this guy says to himself, we're all dead. So this time I've drawn the short straw, and I better do something about it. And, this guy loops 2 belts of ammo on and just stands up and just blows the snot out of the enemy. And lo and behold, gets his buddies out of it. Or, runs out and is, running through hail of fire to pick up guys who've been wounded and bringing them back. It is unthinkable that anybody would consciously decide to do this. And when you realize people are willing to make that sort of sacrifice, when it comes time to write dialogue for somebody who's going to honor that sort of sacrifice, it comes pretty easily, and is certainly very heartfelt.
At the end of Ruin, when Corran, he was kind of skirting close to the dark side, did you ever really consider having him go over?
Well, I think dealing with the dark side is something which every Jedi has to do at some point. And I think really it's been really interesting watching some of the discussions, because there are people who will claim that Corran really didn't go over to the dark side. When he delayed for that nanosecond, killing Cheddaw Shai. But in reality, it's my opinion that he did go over. That momentary cruelty was an act of evil. It was an act of the dark side. It wasn't the same as blowing up a planet or a star system. Corran's an underachiever there. But that's going to be something that he has to deal with, because once you've gone over there, once you've gone that far, you can do it again. And for him, what provoked him was the fact that Cheddaw Shai had murdered his friend. Well, what's going to happen to Corran if someone murders one of his kids? If someone murders his wife? If someone murders other friends? And so this is very realistically, it's something that he's got to deal with before he can be effective again. And I think that'll be a hell of a story to write. So.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I really liked that part of Dark Tide. There's always been a lot of debate over what qualifies as a dark side action, especially now that we're playing the role-playing game again. The debate has raged on and on, and I think that was a really good example. The dangerous things to watch out for aren't necessarily blowing up the billions at one shot, but the small, really almost minuscule evils that we can perform.
Yeah, I think Ralph Hilbert, who's was actually taught at the University of Vermont where I went to college, was an expert in the Nazi extermination of the Jews. And one of the comments that either he made or someone else made, and he quoted, was as they went and looked at the Holocaust, and they just looked at the sheer logistics of moving that many people to the death camps, it meant that the people who were most effective at killing people were the bookkeepers, were the guys who made sure that the trains got right away, and that the face of evil then was not, just this maniacal Hitler, but it's a little bookkeeper, so that evil can have many different guises. And for Corran, it was, it was a little self-indulgence. It was just a little viciousness of saying, look, guy, you're dead, and I want you to know you lost. And that was really cruel. Granted, it was being cruel to somebody who was evil to the core, but that's still an act of evil.
Corran has got an absolutely steel ego. Okay? Yeah. The idea that he would give in to anything that smacks of evil, that would be the destruction of him. Okay, and that's the thing is when you look at Corran there not going to the temptation of the dark side, and yet you get to Ruin, and he realizes that he was flirting really, really hard with it. Maybe have taken a step over the line, and that's why at the end of Ruin, he basically says, I need some time.
But that was another one that was necessary, because here you had a situation where, the outcome was not what we all thought it was going to be. And, the politicians, really, to save their own skins, have got to hang somebody out to dry. And the most expedient thing to do was either blame the Jedi or blame a Jedi. And Corran was in a position where he felt he wasn't going to be useful in the future anyway, at least not for a while. So it was easier for him to take the blame. And that just injects some real life politics into things. So.
Yeah.
Normally I don't think very much about speculative projects, but, just because of the way Corran was left at the end of the Dark Tide duology, I certainly got some ideas rolling around in my brain where I could pick up after all that stuff was done. I'm thinking if I were to do another Corran book, I would love to do it first person. So, well, maybe there'll be another one. We'll see.
We definitely look forward to seeing that.
And I don't think you've seen the last of Corran. I've talked to some of the other authors, and I think he's going to show up in some other places. So.
Okay.
I talked with Greg Keyes, who's got 2 books coming up, and Greg's a good friend, and he's an absolutely dynamite writer. Look at Greg's other novels, and be aware that, Greg can handle dark and dire and nasty very, very well, and give you a really good, the cool thing about Greg is that because he's an anthropologist by training, he's got a really good angle in on helping to develop cultures and develop different portions of the Vong culture. So he's going to bring a lot to it. The stuff that they've given him to write and work on is really, really good. And so I'm confident his books will be great. And of course, Aaron Alston got tapped for 2 books, and there's absolutely no fear that Aaron will turn out stuff that's just stunning. And that's really one of the coolest things about the NJO is that as each project gets done, a little bit more depth gets layered in, so you get a bigger and bigger picture about the whole thing.
This is the one fun thing about writing Star Wars and working with the other writers, is that across the board, I found that the writers have got a lot of respect for each other's work, and we really try and be true to what they're doing. So it's really cool to watch these characters being used, these characters being expanded in the same feel as, I was trying to do. So when you're working in someone else's universe, you know that you don't have any rights, any legal rights to those characters. But Lucasfilm has been really nice and really been fairly respectful of, trying to make sure that the characters are handled well. And, I've talked to some of the writers who've used Corran, for example, and I know that they've done a good job with him. So that's a neat thing.
How did you like Ganner's fate in the NGO series, being considered as a god by the Yuuzhan Vong?
Interesting. That's an interesting approach. He was a character. If I was going to go back and if I had been going to go back and to write more, he was a character that I really wanted to explore. He was a character I had a lot of fun writing, and so it's cool that he rose to some prominence. Matt is a great writer. I loved his book Heroes Die. I remember him at a convention after I'd learned that he had been brought into the Star Wars line to do stuff, and he and I talked about it, and I knew he was going to do a stunning job.
His stuff came after mine did, but he was, and a number of the writers who came after my stuff were very courteous, and though they did not need to, called me up and said, I'm thinking about doing this. Do you think that would work? Et cetera, et cetera.
Wow, that's
and
nice.
That was, it really was, and that was, and that was the same. I did the same thing with Kevin, with the tail end of iJedi, and Tim and I throwing stuff back and forth. All of us have got a lot of respect for each other, and being able to use somebody else's material, very much of an honor. And so you want to make sure that you got it right. You want to make sure that they're happy.
Even though you don't have any more books coming out after Rune, you mentioned in your last interview on Jedi Talk that you'd been part of the planning for the outline of the entire New Jedi Order series.
Right.
are you now more involved in overseeing in an overseeing position to help Lucasfilm keep the expanded universe on a good track then, or?
No, there's been, no discussion of that right now. I mean, I was there to help kick it off, and we had a fairly specific outline for what we wanted to do in the first year and a half, with other things developing as the story went along, following these major chunks. And, now it's going to be up to Del Rey and Lucasfilm talking to the different authors that they bring in to determine what they're going to want to do. And my personal feeling is this. I know from having worked in Star Wars, from having worked in Battletech and other universes, that when you can allow the authors to find the story that they want to be able to tell, you get much better books than call them up saying, hey, look, this is what we want, this is the story we want you to deliver. Let's face it, we've got a long saga going on here. And let's say, for example, Planet X is going to be taken over by the Vong. And this is something that we tell an author they have to put into their book. Well, that author can decide that the takeover of that planet is something that we learn because the story is going to be about refugees escaping that planet. Or the takeover is going to be learned because he's going to tell stories about a Jedi Knight who dies defending that planet. As long as that author gets a chance to choose the story he's going to tell or she is going to tell, so that they're doing something that they really want to do, then we're going to have great stories. And I certainly trust Lucasfilm and Del Rey to be able to do that. And some of the other authors that they're bringing in are top flight. I mean, I'm really happy to see some of the talent they got coming in.
With upcoming Star Wars projects, is there anything in the works, and are we ever going to see you back as a novelist?
Well, right now the policy is that authors that they're bringing into the new Jedi Order are going to get, one bite of the apple, as it were. So right now the Dark Tide books essentially were my bite of the apple. Whether or not there's going to be other opportunities for me to do stuff, I'm not exactly sure. But I still talk to the people at Lucasfilm, and like I say, as I've always maintained, they are absolutely wonderful to work for, and they know that if they needed someone to fill in or something like that, they've got my phone number.
Would you feel correct in doing the last New Jedi Order? Because the impression that or the feeling that I'm getting at least is that after New Jedi Order, we're going to move on to a different character set, and if anybody's left, and we're gonna start seeing some newer heroes come into play and stuff like that, and this is going to be kind of the cap of the Star Wars, the Magnificent Seven adventures. Would you want that responsibility to do that last one?
I think that, I'd certainly be honored if my name was discussed as being the person to deal with that sort of stuff. I feel really, in some ways, I've already been able to do something like that in doing the Union comic and marrying Luke and Mara Jade off. So I've already had my bite at the apple of doing something which is really, really cool. And setting something in stone for that, for the canon. I think it would be a lot of fun. I think that the book that I have in mind right now is a little less ambitious, and would be, would essentially be the last book in the Corran Horn cycle, or a book that, rehabs Corran, which would be more the kind of thing that they would do as paperback. But no, if they wanted me to do the last hardback, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. And you're right, it would really be a heck of a task, but I'm pretty sure I could do it. Would certainly give everything, give it my full attention and full effort to get it right. So.
You did 2 entries in the first mega series that they did with New Jedi Order. Was the timeline a bit different when you got to take? Because your books seem to fit in quite well, because you were basically writing the characters you knew and loved for all these years, but you were moving into a different series where you had a lot more layers of bureaucracy, I guess you could say, and a lot more pieces moving at the same time. Was the process writing those 2 books, Dark Tide 1 and 2, significantly different than writing your X-Wing books that you were kind of in charge of yourself?
It wasn't, only because they brought me in to help plan the New Jedi Order. So I was part of the team that Del Rey brought in, and they knew from the beginning that I was going to be doing Onslaught and Ruin. I was going to be doing the the Dark Tide set. So because I was involved with that, and we planned out by and large what was going to happen over 5 years, and rather specifically what was going to happen in the first year and a half, I pretty much knew what was going on. So that I was not in a bad situation there. It's very much parallel to the situation that I've been in with BattleTech. Being on the development team means that you can help shape the future, and then the work that you do sort of solidifies that future going forward. So for me, it was, yes, I was working in someone else's universe, but by the same token, they gave me a little bit more access to what was going on and a little bit of control over what was going on. So I felt really, really comfortable with it. For me, the interesting thing about those books was I really got, in my mind, I got to have Corran come to a stopping point. I had taken him from being somebody who understood he had no Jedi heritage all the way to, by the end of Ruin, somebody who realized just, the traps, the pitfalls, the downside of all of this stuff. So he'd come through a full story arc, and I was content to let go at that point. If I was given a shot to go back and play with him again, I'd be happy to. But I was content with what was going on.
And in terms of Star Wars, I just think I really am very thankful to everybody who's enjoyed the books that I've done. Fans have been incredibly kind to me down through the years, and still love the universe. I love all the guys that I've worked with.
Because of the X-Wing books, I've been to Germany, to the Czech Republic, to Russia, doing conventions and stuff. So Star Wars has been great for me, and it's just seeing that enthusiasm. I mean, when I grew up, Russia, it was the Cold War, and to go to Russia and be at a convention in St. Petersburg, and being invited to take pictures with the local 501st group, it's like, wow. Just very impressive.
Yeah. Okay, well, again, thanks for joining on Jedi Talk. It's always a great pleasure to have you on. You're welcome to come back anytime.
It's great fun. Thanks for having me.
Okay, may the Force be with you, Mike.
Hey, thanks a lot. You too.
Bye.
So we have with us sci-fi author Greg Bear, who's also contributed to several rather big novel universes. So when it comes to your Star Wars book, Rogue Planet, I remember at that time, Vector Prime had just come out, Chewbacca had died, there was in the newspaper, and people were freaking out. Yeah. And then this little book with Anakin on the cover, Kid Anakin on the cover, came out, and I read it, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to get back to this New Jedi Order series, only to find out like a year or two later that everything in this book that you wrote is connected to that series. And then I had to go back to it and figure out, oh, I missed all this stuff. Now it's all connected. I didn't, because when it came out, I didn't realize the connection, because those connections didn't really pop up until probably a year or two later when the New Jedi Order got a little further on, and you realized, this has started way back then.
They let me have some freedom, but they also wanted me to put some things in, so I was able to put in some subject matter that would get developed later on. The one thing I did create on my own that they used a lot later on was this planet called Zonoma Sakot, which I guess ended up in dozens of novels thereafter. If you
that was a very important
planet,
that was a very important Star Wars planet that they used. Yeah,
I was the first to do that, and they didn't tell me to write that, so I guess I created Zonoma Sakot.
What was your influence for that planet? What drew you to want to do it, or is it just the hardcore sci-fi in you that, like, why not?
Well, it's not really hardcore sci-fi. It's pulp. It's space opera. It's the grandiose, glorious joy of writing about huge spaceships and traveling through the stars and so on. I take it back to when I was reading Doc Smith, Edward E. Smith, back in the 1950s and 60s. The origin of a lot of Star Wars comes out of those classic pulps, and to some extent, there's a fair amount of Isaac Asimov, the Foundation series, in the Star Wars universe. And so they were able to be inspired by it and give it a visual magnificence, which hasn't been, exceeded since the time of the science fiction magazine covers back in the day. Giant spaceships, planets blowing up, Frank R. Paul illustrations, all that stuff leads to what we love today as Star Wars.
I created a fictional world
called Zonoma Sakot. And Zonoma Sakot was a planet that actually could sprout rocket engines and take off from its solar system.
One of my favorite themes has always been the Generation Starship. Of course, it begins with Universe by Robert Heinlein. Some earlier stories carried on the notion of the Generation Starship, but I think Universe, Orphans in the Sky, carried it to a really detailed degree, really wonderful story. Brian Aldiss picked it up in one of his early novels, Nonstop, which published in the United States as Starship, and I love that book. And then we get, the theme being carried on in stories kind of like Rendezvous with Rama and that sort of thing. I do a bit of that in Eon. The metaphor, of course, is, heck, we're all going into life naked, cold, and wondering what the hell's going on. And how is that not, Earth is got to be something like a Generation Starship.
Another question here says, what was it like to be a part of the collaborative process with Del Rey for the New Jedi Order, and with Rogue Planet serving as sort of the prequel?
Well, the Star Wars people had a certain plan they wanted to follow through. They only wanted me to include a couple of characters and a couple of settings. But what I did was I created Zonoma Sakot, this planet that can sprout rocket engines and basically leave its solar system whenever it gets irritated. And Zonoma Sakot was used in other Star Wars novels, which is kind of, wonderful. And I wonder, I haven't read them all, but I wonder what they did with it. But, creating that kind of stuff and then having people run with it, that's great fun.
It's many, many copies out there. In fact, that's how I ruined my autograph, was signing all those Star Wars books.
You ruined it.
Yeah, there was going to, and again, the fans, the kids, the young readers, but also the older readers are amazing in these franchises. They just love these books, and you got to give them honor and credit here that they are among the most enthusiastic and sometimes the most knowledgeable.
On the positive side, one of the fans wants to know if you have any fond memories of your work with Del Rey and Lucasfilms.
Absolutely. Getting out to the ranch at LucasArts and visiting with them. I never actually got to meet Lucas, but going out there and seeing the artwork and the artifacts and stuff, that was fabulous.
The Star Wars book I was given a chance to write in between the lines, so to speak, and given a remarkable amount of freedom, and that made that enjoyable too. In a sense, we're all kind of working within the larger science fictional context, and so to be given a chance to focus specifically on something like that is really interesting. It allows you to squeeze down and again channel a way of thinking about a story. I understood Star Wars right away. As soon as it came out, I was a fan. I loved the special effects. I knew people who'd worked on the special effects, and was able to write that book pretty quickly because they gave me the opportunity to write about Darth Vader as a young kid, and that was pretty extraordinary. And they didn't change much, so I guess I either fit in, or I know how to write in the universe that they're describing.
I love mythology, language, history, weird physics, astronomy, spaceship design, engineering, political stuff. So it all influences my writing.
So what do you think the role of a sci-fi writer is? What's your goal?
To entertain people.
Okay.
People may not know what they want, but they know what they like. Mm-hmm. And so when they find something they like, they really attach to it, and then they can go deep in it. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that, if you're giving them a good science fiction novel, they're also thinking hard thoughts about their lives in the future.
What was it like working with Greg Bear with Rogue Planet? Because he said you were in that, you were talking to him to have Vergier in there.
Yeah, I was at that meeting where he was talking about what he wanted to do. And I just saw this way for him to bring one of our characters on stage early on, and he was amenable to it. So, yeah, that was a terrific story meeting.